A millionaire's solitary life. Johnny Trent had become accustomed to his wealth and the luxury that surrounded him. The sprawling penthouse with its panoramic views of the city skyline, the sleek black sports cars parked in his garage, the expensive artwork decorating every wall, and the personal chef who prepared his meals. All of these things had come to symbolize the life he had worked tirelessly to build. But despite all the extravagance, he couldn't escape the deep emptiness that gnawed at him from within. The ache started 5 years ago when his only child, Mina, succumbed to a rare illness that no doctor had been able to predict or cure. Johnny had always been a man of action, a businessman who thrived on challenges and solutions, but this was one battle he had lost. He couldn't fix the problem, couldn't save his daughter, and ever since that moment, everything else felt insignificant. Mina had been his whole world. Her laughter, her energy, her bright, inquisitive mind. It had all been cut short too soon. The grief was suffocating, and it seemed no matter how many business deals he closed, no matter how much money he made, nothing filled the hole that Mina had left behind. Every night after returning home from work, Johnny would stand outside her room, staring at the door that remained closed, as if he couldn't bear to face the space where she no longer lived. It was as if keeping the room locked away preserved the memory of her, but at the same time, it kept the pain alive. On the rare occasions he allowed himself to speak about her, Johnny would say that Mina was the best part of him. She was his reason for living, and when she was gone, he felt like a man adrift at sea, tossed by waves of doubt and loneliness. His former friends, those who had been part of his high society circle, could never truly understand what he had gone through. They tried to offer support, but their words never seemed to match the weight of the grief he carried. In their eyes, Johnny had everything anyone could ever want. What did it matter if he was mourning the loss of a daughter? After all, he could buy anything he wanted. But Johnny didn't want material things anymore. He didn't care about the luxurious dinners, the private parties, or the expensive vacations. The things he once worked for so tirelessly now felt hollow, shallow, and unimportant. What he longed for was purpose, a reason to wake up every day. He needed something to fill the emptiness, something meaningful. This need for purpose, for connection, was what had driven him to visit the Children's Hope foster home earlier that day. At first, it had just been another routine visit. His foundation had regularly supported the foster home through donations and investments, but something was different this time. The moment he stepped inside, he felt an inexplicable pull, a need to do more than just write a check. The foster home was a modest facility, its walls painted in soft pastel colors and filled with the sound of children laughing and playing. Johnny had seen this before, had been in countless homes just like it. But as he walked through the halls that afternoon, his eyes were drawn to a group of 7 girls sitting together in the corner of a room. They were sisters, each one of them uniquely beautiful, their faces a mixture of quiet strength and vulnerability. He didn't know what it was about them that grabbed his attention. Maybe it was the way they seemed so different from the other children. Older than the others, perhaps, and yet still so young in their own way. They had an unspoken bond between them, a sense of protection for each other that Johnny found both heartwarming and heartbreaking. It was clear that they had been through a lot, and yet there they were, still standing, still holding on to one another. Johnny couldn't stop himself from walking over to them. He knelt down to meet their eyes, offering them a warm smile. The girls looked up at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The oldest, Ava, who appeared to be around 16, was the first to speak. "Hello, sir," she said softly, her voice steady but cautious. Johnny could sense the hesitation in her words, the subtle layers of distrust. It was understandable. These girls had lived through hardships Johnny couldn't even begin to comprehend. They had been bounced between foster homes, each one a temporary stop along a journey they never asked for. Johnny introduced himself, explaining his role in helping the foster home. But the girls weren't interested in that. They had seen enough well-meaning strangers come and go to know that the promises didn't often result in lasting change. But Johnny was different. Something about him struck a chord with Ava. She could see the sadness in his eyes, a sadness that mirrored her own. It was in that moment that Johnny felt something shift inside him. He had always been driven by business, by success, by the need to outdo himself. But here, with these 7 girls, he felt something else, a deeper calling, one that had been buried beneath his wealth and achievements for far too long. He wanted to help them, not just with money, but in a way that would change their lives forever. The idea came to him in a flash, as if it had been there all along, waiting for him to recognize it. Adoption. 7 girls, all sisters, all in need of a stable, loving home. Johnny knew he could provide that. He had the resources, the space, and the means to give them a better life than they had ever dreamed of. But as soon as the idea took root, Johnny was confronted with the reality of what it would mean. Adopting 7 black girls, all of whom came from difficult backgrounds, would raise more than a few eyebrows in his social circles. Johnny was well aware of the skepticism that would follow. He could already hear the whispers behind his back, the mocking laughter, the questions about why a wealthy white man would choose to take on such an enormous responsibility. Still, none of it mattered. Johnny knew what he had to do. This was about giving these girls the chance to build their futures in a way that he never could for Mena. Johnny had been given a second chance at family, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. He had a lot to offer, more than just money, and he was determined to share it with these girls, to provide them with the love and stability they deserved. The paperwork was overwhelming, the legal process long and tedious, but Johnny pushed through every obstacle. As the weeks passed, the foster home administrators were amazed at his commitment. He didn't waver in his decision, despite the increasing doubts from his friends and peers. People couldn't understand why he would take on such a challenge. Johnny didn't care. The only opinion that mattered to him was his own. When the adoption was finalized, Johnny's life was forever changed. His penthouse, once a monument to his success, now became a home filled with the sound of 7 girls who were still learning what it meant to belong. Ava took on the role of the big sister with a fierce protectiveness that impressed Johnny. She helped him navigate the challenges of raising such a large family. And as the weeks turned into months, Johnny grew closer to the girls, each one finding a special place in his heart. But the laughter from his peers didn't stop. In fact, it intensified. They couldn't fathom what Johnny was doing. Some of them even openly mocked him, wondering how long he would last before the weight of the responsibility broke him. They didn't believe in his ability to be a father to these girls. They thought it was just another one of his fleeting projects, a passing phase. But Johnny didn't care about their doubts. He was focused on something far more important, the future of these 7 girls who had now become his daughters. And deep inside, Johnny knew that this decision was the most significant one he had ever made. It was the one that had restored purpose to his life. Little did Johnny know, however, that the same people who mocked him would soon find themselves on their knees, begging for mercy. The twists of fate were already set into motion, and the true story was only just beginning. The rise of the girls. Johnny Trent's decision to adopt the 7 sisters had left many people in his high society circle scratching their heads, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer scope of what lay ahead. The girls' arrival in his life had been a whirlwind. There were 7 of them, each with a different personality, each carrying their own baggage, and each with an unspoken fear. Fear of being abandoned again, fear of not being good enough. But Johnny was determined. His wealth, his power, and his business acumen meant nothing in this new world. Here he wasn't just a millionaire businessman. Here he was a father, and this was a family. The girls' transformation under his care was nothing short of miraculous, and over time, Johnny began to see that what they needed most wasn't just his money or status. It was something deeper, something that only love, patience, and time could provide. At first, the girls had been tentative, unsure of Johnny's intentions. They were used to disappointment, to moving from one foster home to the next, and they didn't trust that their situation could be any different. But slowly, Johnny proved them wrong. Ava, the eldest, had been the most reluctant to open up to him. She was 16, a teenager caught between childhood and adulthood, and the weight of her responsibilities as the protector of her sisters had hardened her. The world had already taught her not to rely on anyone but herself. Johnny understood that. He saw the quiet pain in her eyes, the way she carried the burden of her siblings as though it were her duty. He never pushed her, never asked her to change. Instead, he let her be. He gave her space, but he was always there when she needed him. One evening after dinner, Johnny sat with Ava in the living room, a rare moment of peace between them. Ava had never known what it felt like to have someone truly care about her well-being, and Johnny could tell that she was still struggling with the idea of having a father. "You don't have to pretend with me, Ava," Johnny said softly. "I know it's not easy. You don't need to protect me or anyone else. You're allowed to just be a kid, you know." Ava looked at him, her face unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she exhaled deeply, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to stop protecting them," she said, her eyes focused on the floor. "I don't know what it's like to not have to fight for them, to not be the one to keep them safe." Johnny understood. The weight of the responsibility she carried was heavier than anything he could comprehend. But he wasn't going to let her carry it alone anymore. He was there for her, and for all of them. Over time, Johnny's patience and love began to work wonders. Slowly, the girls started to open up. Each one had their own way of healing, their own way of coming to terms with their pasts, and Johnny learned to meet each of them where they were. Sophia, the second oldest, was a budding artist. She spent hours sketching, drawing, and painting in the little studio Johnny had set up for her in the corner of the house. Her artwork was beautiful, but it was also raw, filled with the emotion of a life that had been anything but easy. Johnny encouraged her to keep creating, to express herself without fear of judgment. Then there was Mia, who was 12, and whose love for reading and history made her one of the most curious children Johnny had ever met. She would often spend hours at the library, poring over books about distant civilizations and great explorers, her mind constantly seeking to learn. Johnny took it upon himself to ensure she had access to all the resources she needed. He knew she was destined for greatness. Lily, the youngest at 5, was a whirlwind of energy and joy. Her laughter was infectious, and she quickly became the heart of the house, bringing lightness and laughter to every room she entered. Johnny would often find himself following her around the house as she ran circles around him, her tiny feet barely touching the floor. In the evenings, when they all gathered together for dinner, Johnny saw something extraordinary. The girls, who had once been so fractured, now sat together as a unit. They were still learning to trust, to love, and to forgive themselves, but they were a family in the truest sense of the word. The bond between the girls deepened as Johnny provided them with something they had never had before: stability. For the first time in their lives, they didn't have to worry about being moved from one home to the next. They didn't have to fear being forgotten, abandoned, or left behind. They had a future they could believe in. And it wasn't just because Johnny was wealthy. It was because he was present. He listened to them. He cared for them. But it wasn't just the girls who were changing. Johnny was too. As the weeks and months went by, Johnny began to rediscover a side of himself he had long buried. He no longer viewed his wealth as the center of his existence. It wasn't the luxury cars or the pristine suits that mattered anymore. It was the smiles of his daughters. It was hearing them laugh in the next room, or watching them compete in a friendly game of soccer in the backyard. Johnny found himself waking up every day with a renewed sense of purpose, one that was not defined by business deals or financial gains, but by the lives of the 7 girls he had adopted. The world, however, wasn't as supportive as Johnny had hoped. His social circle, those people who had once been his closest friends, continued to question his decision. They didn't understand why he had chosen to adopt 7 girls, especially not black girls, who came from a troubled background. The whispers grew louder. Some of his old friends tried to dissuade him, warning him that he was about to lose everything: his reputation, his business connections, his place in the elite world he had fought so hard to build. They suggested that Johnny was making a spectacle of himself, that his decision was born of guilt or some sort of misguided impulse. Johnny couldn't care less about their opinions. He had been making money all his life, but now he realized that the true wealth he had gained was in the love and trust of his daughters. However, life in Johnny's new world wasn't without its challenges. He had to balance the demands of running his businesses while raising 7 children. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when Johnny felt overwhelmed, when the weight of his responsibility seemed too much to bear. But he never let the girls see his struggle. He never let them feel like they weren't his priority. Ava, now 17, began to thrive under Johnny's mentorship. Her protective instincts softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to dream beyond her role as a caretaker. Johnny helped her apply for scholarships, and soon she was accepted to a prestigious college. It was the first step toward a future none of them had ever imagined. Ava's acceptance into college became a symbol of the family's transformation, proof that they were capable of achieving greatness, no matter the obstacles they had faced in the past. Sophia's artwork was featured in a local gallery. Mia, at just 12 years old, became a history prodigy, earning accolades for her knowledge and insight into historical events. Johnny watched with pride as the girls began to blossom, each one carving their own path toward success. But not everyone shared in their joy. Johnny's peers continued to mock him, questioning his ability to raise these girls, to give them what they needed. They saw him as a man who had gotten caught up in some sentimental fantasy. But Johnny, resolute and unwavering, continued to pour his heart into his daughters. The more they achieved, the more his daughters began to wonder if they had underestimated him and the girls. Johnny's world had changed forever, but so had theirs. The 7 girls, once abandoned, forgotten, and alone, were now a force to be reckoned with. Little did Johnny know, the same people who had laughed at his decision to adopt 7 black girls would soon be on their knees, begging for mercy. The power of love, resilience, and determination was about to prove that the greatest force in the world wasn't money, but family. Shadows from the past. As Johnny Trent stood at the balcony of his penthouse, overlooking the shimmering skyline of the city, he reflected on just how much had changed in his life over the past year. The hustle of the city was still there, the ever-present hum of ambition and wealth. But Johnny had stepped away from that world. At least he had, in a sense. His focus was no longer solely on business deals or social circles. His focus had shifted. It now lay in the 7 girls who had become his daughters. He found himself watching their progress with a pride that was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The transformation had been remarkable. Ava, once guarded and withdrawn, was now thriving in ways Johnny had never imagined. Her first year at college was proving to be a success, as she blossomed into a confident young woman, navigating the challenges of her studies while still remaining close to her sisters. Johnny's quiet support had allowed her to believe in her potential, and Ava, for the first time in her life, believed she was worthy of something more. Sophia, the talented artist, had expanded her horizons beyond the small local galleries. Her work was now being recognized by prestigious art institutions, and Johnny had made sure to help her with every step of her journey. He financed her first solo exhibition at a renowned gallery downtown, a moment she would remember forever. The pride in her eyes was a sight Johnny would treasure forever. Lily, now a joyful 6-year-old, had become the little spark of energy that kept the house alive. Her bright smile and infectious laughter could turn any gloomy day into a celebration. Johnny's heart warmed every time he watched her run through the halls, full of life and excitement, her dreams as boundless as her spirit. But the road hadn't always been smooth. There were moments of difficulty, moments when the weight of responsibility seemed insurmountable. Raising 7 children, especially girls with such varying backgrounds and needs, was not without its challenges. Johnny had learned to juggle the demands of his business empire while making sure each girl received the time, care, and attention she needed. The late nights at the office became fewer and farther between as Johnny realized that his true work, his true legacy, was at home with his daughters. And yet, while Johnny was focused on his family, the world outside wasn't so kind. His wealth and the way he had chosen to use it had earned him enemies. In the years that followed his adoption of the 7 girls, whispers grew into full-blown rumors, and those who had once admired him for his success now looked at him with a mixture of disdain and disbelief. He had chosen to throw away everything he had built for the sake of 7 girls who didn't fit into the world he had once ruled. For many, it didn't make sense. Johnny's circle of elite friends began to shrink. Those who remained were increasingly skeptical, questioning his decisions, questioning his motives. There were those who continued to mock him, as they had in the beginning, but Johnny was resolute. He didn't care about their opinions. The opinions that mattered now were those of his daughters. Their lives had begun to change, and Johnny had given them something none of them had ever had before: hope. But as Johnny's family grew stronger, the cracks in his old world began to widen. He had never been someone who enjoyed conflict, but now, the people who had once been his closest allies began to turn against him. The gossip began to seep into the walls of his business empire, a whispered campaign of doubt and suspicion. It all came to a head one fateful evening. Johnny had just returned from a business trip when he was greeted by his lawyer, Robert, who was waiting for him in his office. "Johnny, we need to talk," Robert said, his voice tense. Johnny's brow furrowed as he walked over to his desk, sinking into the plush chair. "What is it, Robert? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's the board members," Robert said, hesitating. "There's talk that they want to take your company away from you." Johnny's pulse quickened, but he remained calm. His mind raced as he tried to piece together the pieces of the puzzle. "Why? I've always been the one in control. I built this company. There's no way they can just—" "They don't care about how you built it anymore, Johnny," Robert interrupted, his voice low. "They're upset about your personal life. The adoption. The girls. They think it's damaging your reputation. They think you've lost focus." Johnny's hands clenched into fists. The anger surged inside him, but he fought to keep his composure. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his daughters, and he would not let them be a reason for the destruction of everything he had worked for. "They think what?" Johnny's voice was cold, but beneath the surface, he was seething. "They think it's a distraction," Robert said, lowering his gaze. "They think you're losing your edge. They're worried that you'll lose sight of the business in favor of raising a family that they can't relate to." Johnny stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I've worked too hard for too long to let them tear everything down. This is my company, my life, my family. If they want to take it from me, they're going to have to fight for it." Robert was silent for a moment before speaking again. "Johnny, they're not just going to let it go. There's already talk of a takeover. Some of the other board members have aligned with investors who think they can run the company better." Johnny's mind spun, and for a moment he felt a sense of panic. But then, as his eyes scanned the photos on his desk, his daughters' smiling faces, the reminders of everything he had built, he realized something important. This wasn't about business anymore. This was about everything that truly mattered. "Robert, get me the names of the investors who are trying to take this from me," Johnny said, his voice firm. "I'm going to make sure they regret underestimating me." For the next few days, Johnny focused every ounce of his energy on defending his company. He fought against the whispers, the rumors, and the doubts that had spread like wildfire. He used every connection he had, every resource at his disposal, to make sure that no one could take away what he had built, not just his company, but the life he had created with his daughters. But the battle wasn't easy. The board members, the investors, and even some of his closest friends were relentless in their campaign to unseat him. The tension reached a boiling point when, during a board meeting, Johnny was faced with a challenge from one of his most trusted allies. A man named Richard, who had been by his side for years, stood up and publicly questioned Johnny's leadership. "You've let personal matters cloud your judgment, Johnny," Richard said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Your decisions are no longer about the business. They're about you playing the role of a savior to these girls." Johnny stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the room pressing down on him. His anger flared, but he swallowed it down. This was bigger than just a personal attack. It was a direct challenge to everything he had worked for, the family he had built, the future he was trying to secure. "I've never been about playing a role," Johnny said, his voice steady but laced with authority. "I'm here because I believe in something more. I believe in family. I believe in resilience. And if you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you tear that down, you're gravely mistaken." The room fell silent, and Johnny could feel the tension simmering. But his words had struck a chord. Richard's challenge had been a rallying cry for Johnny to prove that he could face not only the challenges of business, but the challenges of his personal life too. Johnny's resolve hardened, and he was no longer just fighting for his company. He was fighting for his daughters, for the family they had created together. And as he prepared for the battle that lay ahead, Johnny knew that the enemies he faced were far more dangerous than any rival business mogul. The true test of his strength was coming, and it would force him to confront his own past and the shadows that had haunted him. The world would soon learn that Johnny Trent had made one thing abundantly clear. When it came to his family, he would stop at nothing to protect them, even if it meant taking on the very people who had once called him their friend. The battle for the future. Johnny Trent's world had always been built on a foundation of power and wealth, but in the past few months, that foundation had been tested in ways he never could have anticipated. What had begun as a personal decision to adopt 7 girls, each with their own traumas, dreams, and complexities, had become a public spectacle. His business empire, the company he had worked tirelessly to build, was now at risk, and the very people who had once admired him, who had once called him a friend, were now the ones threatening to tear it all down. It was an unusual sort of war that Johnny found himself in, a war not fought with boardroom strategies or financial leverage, but with his very identity, with his family's future on the line. His enemies weren't just the investors who had started to align against him, or the doubters in his social circle who laughed at his decision to adopt 7 black girls. The real battle was much more personal. It was a war against the very notions of power, privilege, and perception that had once defined his life. The battle wasn't just about retaining his company. It was about defining the life he had built, the values that drove him, and the legacy he would leave behind. The tension in the air was thick. Johnny knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. His business was his lifeblood, but his daughters were his heart, and they were as much a part of his legacy as any boardroom deal or stock market maneuver. The future of his family, of everything he had worked for, was at stake. And in a way, it wasn't just about business. It was about proving that love, resilience, and unity could overcome the system that had once tried to break them. Ava, now 17, had become more than just Johnny's daughter. She had become his partner in this fight. While Johnny focused on keeping the business afloat, Ava was in the background, studying law and helping him strategize. She had always been a fierce protector of her sisters, but now she was learning how to fight in different ways, ways that involved the courts, legal strategies, and the power of words. Johnny had never imagined that he would need to teach his daughter about the darker sides of business, but as the weeks passed, it became clear that Ava's strength and intellect were just as important as Johnny's connections. "Dad," Ava said one evening as they sat in the office, a stack of legal papers in front of them, "we can't let them get away with this. If they take this company from you, they're going to destroy everything you've built, everything we've worked for. But we can fight back. We have the law on our side." Johnny had always been a man of action. He had never been one to back down from a challenge. But this was different. The world he once navigated with ease, boardrooms, meetings, networking, was no longer his focus. He had seen too much of what it meant to love and protect those who needed him. And now he was finding strength in a place he never expected: his children. "You're right, Ava," Johnny replied, looking at his daughter with admiration. "We won't just fight this from the outside. We'll fight it from within. If they want a war, they'll get one. But they're going to regret underestimating us." Meanwhile, the girls were no longer the same group of unsure, frightened sisters who had first entered Johnny's life. They had grown. They had found their own voices, and their individual journeys had begun to carve new paths. Mia, the young prodigy with a love for history, was not just excelling academically. She was becoming a leader in her own right. The board members who had once ridiculed Johnny for his adoption decisions now found themselves in a precarious situation. Mia's intellect, combined with the strategic thinking that Ava had developed, made the girls an unlikely but potent force in the family's battle for survival. Sophia, the artist, had used her platform to speak out. She had always channeled her emotions through her art, but now she was using her growing influence to raise awareness about the injustice that Johnny and the girls were facing. Her artwork, which had once been displayed in local galleries, was now being showcased at protests and charity events. She was becoming the face of resistance, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been underestimated or looked down upon. Even Lily, now 6, had begun to understand the weight of what was happening. Her innocent questions about the grown-up talk in the house became more profound as Johnny and the girls explained, in simple terms, what was at stake. It was a learning moment for all of them, but it also fueled something inside Johnny. This wasn't just about saving his business. It was about teaching his daughters the strength of unity, of standing together in the face of adversity. This was a moment for them to learn the true meaning of resilience. One night, as Johnny sat alone in his office after yet another heated meeting with the board, he found himself staring at the same photograph that had been there for years, the photo of his late daughter, Minna. He traced her smile with his finger, remembering the days when life had seemed so simple, so predictable. But now, everything had changed. Johnny had lost a daughter once. He wouldn't lose this family. He would fight until the very end. But the fight was becoming more complicated. As the pressure from the board mounted, Johnny found himself facing a different kind of challenge, the threat of a hostile takeover. His enemies, now aligned with a powerful consortium of investors, had made it clear that they would stop at nothing to oust Johnny from the company. Their tactics were ruthless, their intentions clear. They believed they could control the company better without Johnny, that his personal life had clouded his judgment and made him a liability. Johnny's every move was being scrutinized. Every decision was being second-guessed. But what his enemies didn't realize was that Johnny Trent had never been a man to back down. His daughters had taught him that sometimes the things you hold most dear are worth fighting for, even if it means facing impossible odds. It was time for Johnny to make his move. In an effort to protect the company, Johnny called upon his old contacts, the ones who had once supported his rise to power. He knew that some of them had distanced themselves from him in recent months, but he also knew that there were still a few who respected him. Slowly but surely, Johnny began to rebuild the network that had made him successful. He appealed to those who still believed in him, not for his wealth, but for his integrity, for his willingness to take a stand for what was right. The battle reached its apex during a pivotal board meeting, where Johnny, alongside his daughters and legal team, prepared to face off against the investors who had been scheming behind his back. The room was tense, the air thick with hostility. Johnny had never been one for theatrics, but this time, he knew that the stakes were higher than ever. The lives of his daughters, the future of his company, and the family he had fought to build all hung in the balance. Ava stood at Johnny's side, her resolve unshakable. Mia, Sophia, and even Lily, who had been quiet throughout the proceedings, now understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about business. It was about everything they had fought for. The love, the unity, the family they had become. And Johnny realized something in that moment. His daughters were his greatest strength. Together, they had become an unbreakable force. As the meeting progressed, Johnny's enemies began to realize that they had underestimated him. The legal maneuvers that Ava had worked on were paying off. The evidence they had gathered, the support from Johnny's old contacts, and the undeniable bond he shared with his daughters gave him a position of power that no one could ignore. And in that moment, Johnny understood something important. This fight wasn't just for the company, it was for the future, for his daughters' futures, and he would stop at nothing to protect them. The board meeting ended in a stalemate. The hostile investors had failed in their attempt to take over Johnny's company. But the victory came at a cost. The war wasn't over. Johnny knew that, but he had won this round. And that meant something. It meant that no one, no matter how powerful, could tear his family apart. And as Johnny walked out of that meeting, hand in hand with Ava and the rest of his daughters, he knew one thing for certain. They were stronger than any obstacle life could throw their way. Together, they were unstoppable. The calm before the storm. The victory that Johnny Trent had secured in the boardroom was sweet, but it was far from over. The investors who had tried to orchestrate the hostile takeover were not the type to retreat quietly. They were like wolves in sheep's clothing, calculating their next move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. But Johnny had a plan. This time, however, he wouldn't be fighting alone. He had something more powerful on his side: the unwavering strength of his family. For the first time in a long while, Johnny found himself standing outside the shadow of business deals and corporate boardrooms. The weight of leadership was heavy, but now, with his daughters beside him, it felt more manageable. They had all grown into individuals who understood the value of resilience, sacrifice, and love. They weren't just children he had adopted. They were his allies, his partners in a world where trust and loyalty had become rare commodities. The months following the board meeting had been filled with quiet moments of reflection. Johnny spent more time with the girls, listening to their hopes, their dreams, and the challenges they still faced. Ava had finished her first year of law school with top honors, and Johnny couldn't have been more proud. Her sharp mind and tenacity were the backbone of their fight, and she had begun to build a reputation of her own, one that was separate from her father's. Sophia had launched a charitable foundation that supported underprivileged youth in the arts, using her success as a platform to give back. Johnny had been there for every step, providing financial support, of course, but more importantly, he had been a sounding board for Sophia as she navigated the complexities of running a nonprofit. Her eyes sparkled with a fire Johnny had never seen before, a fire that was contagious and inspiring. It was clear that Sophia wasn't just creating art, she was creating change. Lily, ever the bright light of their home, had turned 6, and Johnny's heart swelled with pride every time he saw her face light up. The small girl who had once been withdrawn and uncertain was now a beacon of joy, asking questions about everything from the moon's phases to how airplanes stayed in the sky. She had a mind full of curiosity, and Johnny vowed to nurture that curiosity, allowing her to explore the world with an open heart and a sharp intellect. But even as the family grew stronger, Johnny knew that the storm was far from over. The investors had not given up, and Johnny's position remained precarious. The stakes had never been higher, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to protect the life he had built. One evening, Johnny sat in his study, the weight of the world pressing down on him. His fingers hovered over the desk, his mind racing. He had to act. He had to prepare for the inevitable. The company was his legacy, and while it was important, it wasn't the only thing that mattered. His daughters, his family, were his true legacy. The thought of losing them, of them being torn apart by forces beyond their control, made his blood run cold. "Dad," Ava's voice interrupted his thoughts as she entered the room, her face serious. "We need to talk. It's about the investors." Johnny sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew this conversation was coming. "What's happened now?" "They've made their move," Ava said, holding up a letter. They've launched a new legal challenge. They're accusing you of financial mismanagement, claiming that you've diverted company funds to support your personal endeavors, my adoption of the girls, the charity Sophia runs, everything. Johnny leaned back in his chair, his heart sinking. It was the same playbook. Attack his personal life, drag his family through the mud, and tarnish his reputation. They knew it wasn't about the company anymore. It was about Johnny's integrity, his values, and his ability to navigate the ruthless world of corporate politics. "That's absurd," Johnny said, his voice thick with frustration. "They know I've done nothing of the sort. This is just a smear campaign." "I know," Ava said, her voice steady. "But they've got the media on their side. They've already reached out to several outlets. If this goes public, it could destroy everything we've worked for." Johnny stood up and paced the room, his mind racing. He had faced countless challenges in his career, but this felt different. They weren't just attacking his business. They were attacking his family, everything he held dear. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. "We need to turn this around," Johnny said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We can't let them win. I won't let them destroy us." Ava nodded. "I've already contacted a few of our old supporters. They're ready to stand with us. We can fight this in the courts, but we need to be strategic. We can't let them control the narrative." Johnny turned to his daughter, admiration in his eyes. "You've grown into someone I can rely on, Ava. You're not just my daughter. You're my partner." Ava smiled, her determination unwavering. "And I always will be, Dad. We're in this together." As they strategized late into the night, Johnny's thoughts turned back to the girls. They had come so far, and he had promised himself that he would never allow them to feel the sting of rejection or failure again. They had found a place in the world, a place where they were loved, respected, and valued. Johnny would fight to ensure that they would never have to face the darkness of their pasts again. The following days were filled with meetings, both legal and personal. Johnny's network of allies was vast, and although many of the investors who had once stood by him had fallen away, there were still a few who believed in Johnny's vision, in his integrity. These were the people Johnny leaned on, the ones who understood that business wasn't just about profits, it was about people. And Johnny was nothing if not a man who understood the importance of people. But despite the support, the pressure was mounting. The media began to run with the story. Headlines read like venomous arrows, attacking Johnny's character and his motives. The pictures of Johnny with his daughters, once seen as symbols of hope and love, were now twisted into weapons, used to portray him as a man who had lost touch with reality. The media frenzy reached a fever pitch, and soon, even his closest friends were beginning to distance themselves from him. Johnny knew that the media onslaught would only intensify in the coming weeks, but he wasn't afraid. If there was one thing he had learned in this journey, it was that the truth was a powerful ally. And while the world could spin whatever narrative it wanted, Johnny knew that the truth would always prevail. In the midst of the chaos, Sophia found her voice. Her foundation's work was now at the forefront of the media's attention, but Sophia used it to shift the conversation. She refused to let the media focus only on the negative. Through her art, she was speaking out for the underrepresented, for the forgotten voices, and for those who had been silenced by society's expectations. She used her platform to create a counter-narrative, one that showcased her family's strength, resilience, and love. "The world can try to tear us apart," she said at a press conference, her voice steady and powerful. "But they can't break us. We're stronger than they think." Johnny's heart swelled with pride as he watched his daughter stand tall before the cameras. This was her moment, and she was seizing it. She had become more than just a talented artist. She had become a force for change. But the real battle was just beginning. As Johnny and his family prepared for the legal fight that lay ahead, Johnny's mind wandered back to those early days, the moment he had first walked into the children's foster home and had seen those 7 girls. He had never known then what he was signing up for. He had no idea how his life would change, how his world would be turned upside down. But he knew one thing for certain. It had all been worth it. No matter what happened, no matter the challenges they faced, his family had become his strength. And as Johnny faced the storm that was brewing, he was ready for whatever came next. He would protect his daughters. He would protect the life they had built. And together, they would face the future, not as victims of the world's judgment, but as a family united, stronger than ever. The reckoning. Johnny Trent had never been one to back down from a fight. But as the days turned into weeks and the pressure mounted, he found himself questioning the very core of the battle he was engaged in. The media, once a powerful ally in his rise to success, had turned against him with a vengeance. The narrative had been set. Johnny, the wealthy millionaire, had adopted 7 black girls for reasons more selfish than noble. They painted his acts of kindness and his family's unity as something other than what it truly was: love, commitment, and the pursuit of a future built on genuine care and respect. The legal challenges were relentless. The board members who had once supported him were now growing increasingly skeptical. His allies were beginning to fall away one by one, and in their place, whispers of doubt and betrayal spread like wildfire. Johnny's company was under siege, and the life he had built seemed on the verge of crumbling beneath him. Yet through it all, Johnny's resolve never wavered. As the days stretched on, he leaned into his family more than ever before. Ava, now fully immersed in her law studies and helping guide the legal defense, had become his anchor. She understood the system in ways Johnny had never imagined, and her sharp intellect was proving to be an invaluable asset. But it wasn't just Ava's legal acumen that kept Johnny going. It was her unwavering belief in him. Her loyalty was the foundation upon which Johnny rebuilt his sense of self. She was, after all, his partner in this war. And then there was Sophia. Her foundation, which had once been a small project, had exploded in popularity, and she was using it as a platform to not only showcase her art, but to speak out against the injustices her family was facing. She had taken the media's attacks on her father and turned them into an opportunity to amplify their message. Johnny watched as his daughter, once a shy and introspective artist, transformed into a fearless leader. Sophia wasn't just using her voice for herself anymore. She was using it for everyone who had ever been marginalized, for those who had been overlooked and underestimated. She had become the face of the resistance, a symbol of strength in the face of adversity. The girls were no longer just a part of Johnny's world. They had become the world he was fighting for. Lily, now 7, had grown into a bright and inquisitive young girl. She had learned from her older sisters and had begun to ask questions about the world, about fairness, about justice, and about why people sometimes treated others differently. Johnny saw in her the potential to be a force for change one day, someone who would take the lessons of the past and shape a better future. The fight was no longer just about Johnny's company or his reputation. It had become a fight for the soul of his family. Every single day felt like a battle, and Johnny's resolve was being tested in ways he had never experienced. But he wasn't backing down. He couldn't. The investors who had once sought to undermine him were now desperate. Johnny's reputation had taken a hit, but his family's resilience and the growing support for their cause were forces they hadn't anticipated. The more the public learned about Johnny's love for his daughters, about their bond and their journey together, the more people began to rally behind him. Social media campaigns sprang up, calling for justice and an end to the smear campaign. The same people who had once laughed at Johnny's decision to adopt 7 black girls were now the ones apologizing, asking for forgiveness for the way they had judged him. But Johnny knew that their words meant little now. The damage had already been done, and the battle was far from over. The turning point came when Johnny received an anonymous tip. It was a piece of information that no one had seen coming, proof that one of the board members, who had been leading the charge against Johnny, had been secretly funneling money from the company into their own private accounts. The revelation was explosive. It not only proved that Johnny had been the victim of a carefully orchestrated plot, but it also shattered the credibility of those who had been trying to tear him down. Ava immediately sprang into action. She and her legal team moved quickly, gathering evidence and preparing for what would be the most important legal battle of Johnny's life. The moment they had all been waiting for had arrived, the chance to turn the tide in their favor. Johnny sat in his study, his fingers tracing the edge of the desk. The weight of the world had been bearing down on him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of hope. The next few days would be crucial, and he knew that whatever happened, they were not just fighting for a business. They were fighting for the future, his daughter's future. The courtroom was tense the day the trial began. The air was thick with anticipation as Johnny, Ava, and their legal team prepared to face off against the board members who had betrayed him. The opposing lawyers were ruthless, attempting to paint Johnny as a man driven by greed and selfish motives. But Ava's arguments, sharp and calculated, slowly began to dismantle their narrative, piece by piece. This is not a case about financial mismanagement, Ava argued before the judge, her voice steady and commanding. This is a case about integrity, about loyalty, and about the heart of a man who has been unjustly attacked for showing kindness to children who needed him. My father did not adopt these girls for any personal gain. He adopted them because he saw the value in their lives, because he wanted to give them the chance at a future they deserved. The courtroom was silent as Ava's words hung in the air. Johnny could see the flicker of doubt in the eyes of the board members, the realization that they had miscalculated. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about something much bigger, about the truth, about family, and about the power of standing up for what is right. Sophia had taken her art to a new level, using her work to further expose the corruption within the company. Her art, once seen as simply a way for her to express herself, had become a weapon in the fight for justice. She held an exhibition just days before the trial, showcasing pieces that depicted the family's struggles, the pain of judgment, the strength in unity, and the love that had fueled their journey. The exhibition went viral, sparking a movement that reached beyond the confines of the courtroom. It was clear that Johnny's family had become the symbol of resilience, and people all over the world were supporting them. But the battle was far from won. The opposition was still formidable, and Johnny's enemies were prepared to go to any lengths to win. The final phase of the trial was set to begin, and everyone knew that the stakes had never been higher. Johnny had fought this war with every resource he had, but now it was no longer about the money, the business, or the power. It was about proving that his family mattered, that their love and their unity were stronger than anything his enemies could throw at them. As Johnny sat in the courtroom, surrounded by his daughters, he felt a sense of peace. The fight was far from over, but he knew one thing for certain: they had already won. They had proven to the world that love, when tested, could stand the greatest trials. And no matter what the outcome of the trial was, Johnny's family would remain unshaken. This was not the end of the story. This was merely the beginning.